Hello again and welcome to China Manufacturing Decoded. Adrian from the team here and our CEO Renaud's back with me. Hi Renaud.
Hey. Hi Adrian, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. It's a heat wave here in the UK, which is something we don't normally associate with the UK, but I mean, it is summer. I'm not going to complain too much. How are you doing over there in France?
Not too bad. It's my last few days as we're recording the podcast. I'll be in a flight to Hong Kong in 3 days. In 3 days, yeah. But it's July was crazy with heat waves, yeah, and it's very, very dry. Anyway, I think everybody's aware of that now.
Yeah.
It's been all over the news.
Yeah, absolutely. But a good trip for you because you've been all over the place, starting in India and then making your way through to Europe and so back to Asia soon.
Yeah, back to Asia, yes, and back in quarantine, in a hotel quarantine.
Yeah.
So
because it's changing, right?
It changed just a few days ago, like earlier this week. So let me see. Last year, it was 21 days for people coming from a number of countries, like France, UK, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Then they moved it down to 7 days. I forget when, maybe 4 months ago or 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And there's been increasing pressure. And just this week, they said, okay, it's going to be 3 days. Now, 3 days doesn't mean you do your 3 days and you're completely free after that. But if you're a resident, you do 3 days in a hotel of your choice. And then for the next 4 days, I believe, your QR code will be yellow or amber. So they are adopting the same system as in China with the 3 color codes on the QR code on the app. And that means for the next 4 days, you cannot go to restaurant, you cannot go to a certain number of things. However, you can go to offices. So this is, okay, it's better than having to stay in a hotel, right? You can take the food away, eat your sandwich somewhere alone, and you can go to working environments, right? To your company's office, to your whatever, your accountant, your bank, and so on. It's allowed with the mask on, obviously. So it's better than having to do the full 7 days in a hotel. And obviously you have to come back for testing and so on. Now, people might think, oh, that's great to go to China because more and more people actually fly into Hong Kong, do the quarantine in Hong Kong, and then go to China and do the quarantine on the China side. Yeah. Simply because, as you probably know, I think we mentioned that before, is there are not that many flights direct to China, even though it's slightly increasing, but they had a ban until a few days ago. They had a ban, like I think from the UK, you could not fly direct to China at all, right? And they just changed that. But still, even though it's slightly relaxing, there's very few direct flights to China. And some people have had to pay $10,000 or $15,000. I mean, crazy amounts of money to get on one of these flights because there's really not that many, right?
Yeah, and that's just one way as well, by the way, oftentimes.
Yeah. Right. So a lot of people prefer taking the, one-way $500 flight to Hong Kong because there's still a lot of flights going to Hong Kong.
Yep. Rather
than the $10,000 flight to China, and they spend more time in quarantine. Now, for them, it's not going to change much because I don't think they can do 3 days in Hong Kong in a hotel and then right away go and cross the border to Shenzhen. I don't think it's that easy for them because of the remaining 4 days. But I'm not sure. I haven't talked to people who have done that recently, so I don't really know. Maybe they have to, I don't know. If they don't have a place to stay in Hong Kong anyway, maybe they still book the hotel for 7 days. I don't know. I don't know how it works.
But it's an interesting movement in the procedures because maybe where Hong Kong goes, China's eventually going to follow because it makes sense that they both get into a kind of similar rhythm because the whole point is that the Hong Kong government, my understanding is that they want people in Hong Kong to have access to China, but obviously they're trying to work within the rules at the moment.
Yeah, I'm not sure who follows whom. I mean, it seemed like Hong Kong had to follow China for the most part last year. So I don't know if Hong Kong is going to lead China anywhere. Talking about mainland China, things are very much the same. Slightly easier to get a working visa from what I heard since 1 month ago. A few things have slightly eased up, but just today, we were looking at the news before recording this, and there's this sort of a lockdown in Yiwu, which is in Zhejiang province, a little bit south of Shanghai, where a lot of, cheap products are made and sold even wholesale. So there's a certain category of buyers who go to Yiwu, but there's also some other industries that are simply, concentrated in Yiwu, like the, seamless garments, for example, and the what is it? The socks are in Juji, not very far away. I mean, all that kind of textile products that are, knitted together nearly exclusively by machine.
Yeah,
there's a lot of that over there, and that's not just the cheapest ones. There's some others a little bit higher up in the value chain. So it's not just hitting the very cheap products, very cheap buyers. It's hitting a little bit everybody, I guess. Usually non-technical products, I would say, right? Not very advanced products. But it's funny because they say, and I'm reading Reuters, and they say that Yiwu, they say it on Thursday, so it's already been, no, it's today, I think, yes, that it would enter 3 days of silent management, with most of its residents banned from leaving designated areas and some confined to their homes. Silent management means what? Like, don't be like people in Shanghai, just shut up. I don't know what it means.
Well, I think they're trying to do things in a bubble, right? I think some people are still going to work, but they're not going to places like restaurants and things like that.
Yeah. So, let's see where it's going. But the risk is still there in China. Things have relaxed. It's already August, right? The big political congress is in November. They will squash the virus wherever there's a mini outbreak. It's pretty clear now. The holiday resorts in Hainan province, that's the island all the way to the south of China, are also mostly in isolation. People cannot really fly back, from what I understand. They have to do a quarantine before coming back because there was an outbreak there. So so not hitting any, let's say, major manufacturing hub, even though Yiwu by volume is not a minor hub, I would say. But if it's just confined to Yiwu, and if they say it's just 3 days, well, no major impact. However, we've seen a number of emails from Chinese suppliers saying, we are late because of the special restrictions from the government, and in many cases, I'm sure that's not true. They just use it as an excuse because foreign buyers have a very hard time actually checking what happens. And then, and they also say that the military activities along the eastern border after the very highly politicized visit of Mrs. Pelosi, they say that this has disturbed international trade. This has disturbed cargo ships, and that's true. Not much, but there have been some small delays because of that.
Yeah, they rerouted a bit, didn't they? Some of them
rerouted, and they arrived a bit later, and so on and so forth. So there are things happening. It's not all smooth sailing, but hey, compared with what, let me remember, March in South China, and compared with April, May around Shanghai. I mean, this is pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely don't think we'll see a lot of big changes that could really upset the apple cart before the party conference, as you mentioned, in October, November. So
November.
yeah, so I mean, after that would probably be more logically the time when they might try and relax things a bit, especially with Chinese New Year coming as well, I suppose. But that being said, I'm definitely seeing more business travel to China now. So I think more people are accessing it. But yeah, just because the quarantine in Hong Kong's getting a bit shorter, let's not get too excited about mainland China just yet.
Right. Agreed, yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So today's topic is how to optimize your QC inspections and get better results. To begin with, could you explain, please, why this is something that a business might be seeking to do if they're already performing inspections? Why would they seek to optimize them?
Well, if you do, let's say this episode is not really going to be very interesting to the company that doesn't do many inspections or does some inspections on a very wide range of products. So they never really have time to go deep into one product category. Okay, this is more for companies that do a lot of inspections on the same kind of product. So it can be a manufacturing company that does a lot of incoming QC kind of work, right? They might have 3 people doing that full time every day, all day long, and they might be a bit specialized, and one of them might be doing that on on 1 or 2 categories of components all day long. Well, can it be optimized? Yes, usually yes. And same thing for importers. If you send people to your suppliers' factories and they check the quality of the finished products, or they check quality of during production, or they check the component quality and so on. Okay, if you do that often, sort of over and over, or on the same types of products, you gotta sit down and think, how to make it better, because it's always a trade-off, and that's the key. Because in most cases, it's not like you have unlimited resources. You have a batch of 10,000 pieces, and you're gonna pick 200 pieces to check them. So first you do random inspection, probably, rather than full inspections in most cases, right? So why always do level 2? Why not level 1? Why not, a different level, a different severity, a different whatever, right? There's nothing in the standard that says that it should always be the same. Actually, you should work based on data to decide where you need to go more in depth and where you maybe don't need to go in depth, right? The standard even gives you some rules for switching from one severity to the other. So it means that well-performing suppliers will tend to be inspected by checking fewer samples, right? So the inspection will be faster. And the suppliers that often have failures, it's going to be the opposite. More samples checked, which makes sense, right? But they provide rules for that. And there are even rules for switching. It's ISO 2859 -4, I guess. You can, you can see again the suppliers that are performing well for a certain product. It's always relative to a certain product. Don't need to be inspected every single time. You can keep sort of an element of surprise. Maybe they don't know which batch will be checked, but do you really need to check every batch? Maybe not, right? And there's a bunch of ways to make changes. Here I'm just talking about sampling, but there's other ways to do that. And I'm talking about sampling because really people have to understand it's a trade-off. Do you just blindly apply the same rules everywhere on every kind of product, every supplier, every size of the order, every value of the products, or do you put more of your resources where they are more needed? Well, obviously the answer is you want to put more resources where they're more needed, and spend less time, less manpower, and so on, where it's less needed, right? Less needed meaning the risk is lower, maybe the commercial implications if things go wrong are lower, maybe there's less money at stake, there's a good track record of the supplier making this product, there's no, how to say, potential safety implications also. Maybe it's a more simple product, right? So maybe you don't need to go every time. You don't need to check the same level. I don't want to say proportion, but you don't want to follow level 2, let's say, for them, as well as for your more complex products, your bigger orders, etc., right? Yeah, that makes sense. So, yeah. Of course, you want to think about it. Spend your resources wisely, basically.
Right. And I'm thinking this could also be quite a useful cost-saving exercise. As you mentioned, for companies who are doing a lot of inspections, this might be a way to reduce some of the costs, right?
Oh, yeah. So you can say that you keep the resources untouched. And in that case, you want to have better result, right? You want to focus more on the more complex, more risky items or orders, and you will be more likely to detect the issues. And in the end, it means you will have fewer issues and less costly issues for the same budget for appraisal, right? For just checking, trying to detect the issues. But also, you can actually say, hey, do we really need to spend that much? Maybe you have a team of 5 inspectors roaming around, patrolling different factories working for you. Well, do you really need that many, right? If you optimize things, maybe you reduce your budget maybe by 40%. Maybe 2 of them can go, but your risks don't increase in a significant, in a marked manner, right? It's hard to quantify risk, but that's the idea. You reduce your budget, but the risks don't go over an acceptable amount, let's say, an acceptable level. Your exposure to problems, let's say, and the likelihood that you get to these problems, that doesn't go up much, and maybe it's acceptable. Right,
and again, another trade-off, as you've rightly said. So
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So you can keep the same resources. You can reduce your resources, but target the risks better. Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay, good. So if you're now thinking, well, all right, I'm interested in optimizing my inspections, where would you say a buyer or the company involved needs to start by preparing something? What are they preparing?
Well, if you are the company doing the inspections, obviously you need to have a proper standard, right? Because otherwise you can't really understand and interpret the findings of your inspectors, right? Maybe your standard is too tight. Maybe you haven't documented a standard on certain important points. Maybe it's too lax, right? You need to really make sure that you have a proper standard, a suitable standard. That's really, really important. Okay, that's really the first thing to say, to do, I would say. And at the very beginning, again, you start to do inspections. You're not really thinking of optimizing things or making a lot of adjustments. But then once you've done, let's say, 5, 10 inspections on the same product, hey, you have some examples of issues, and you can really use it, or let's say deviations from the specs, and you can use that to document what is acceptable and not acceptable, not only in a written document but also in limit samples, right? I think we wrote an article about boundary samples or limit samples recently. Hopefully we can link to it.
Yeah.
But the idea is you look at whatever it is, a toothbrush
Mm-hmm.
that's produced, and you say, is this the exact color of pink that is acceptable? Well, there's always going to be a deviation from, let's say, a Pantone code or even a golden sample, which, by the way, might have faded a bit. But if you have some limits, one a bit darker, one a bit lighter, for example, one a bit more red, one a bit more gray, then you check, is this between the boundaries? If it is, okay, it's in the acceptable area. Boom. Done. You don't have an inspector scratching his head and then saying, well, I'm going to take some photos, and then you have someone maybe in London or in New York City thinking, ooh, this doesn't look like the same color. How to know? Okay, send me some samples. And then somebody pays DHL or FedEx to send a package, which takes time, takes money.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the end, you say, well, okay, that's okay. I approve it, right? So work on a standard. Try to have a good standard that's really going to make the process more objective, easier, less stressful for all parties, and it's going to make your job to make decisions and approve a batch much easier. Okay, if let's say it's a mechanical product with some parts that you designed, and your designers set some measurement targets with tolerances. Well, that's really a candidate for a very close look. First, when one of your inspectors is spending time checking the product, or the part, what measurements should they spend more time on? Very often there's, maybe 2-3 dimensions that are very important. They're critical to quality, as we say. And maybe the others, as long as they look good and as long as the product or the part looks like the approved sample, it's fine. No need to measure, right? Or maybe you measure it once, maybe in the first article inspection, or just once for every batch. And it all comes from the same mold, and there's really a low risk that there would be discrepancies in tolerances, in dimensions from one part to the other of the same batch. So try to think, because measurements typically take a lot of time, and it's often not very easy to justify that time, by the value actually in detecting issues, right? So an inspector, can just focus on that and gather a lot of measurements and fill out a whole file, and it will look good. But in the end, it might all be wasted time. That's what I mean.
Yeah, okay. I understand. And on the other hand, that's information that, we or our inspectors are going to prepare and have ready. What about information that we gather from the supplier's side before we start such a initiative? Here,
I would say there's 2 approaches. If the number of parts or pieces or products are not going to be, it's not going to be high, it's not going to be a lot of money, then you will rely more on inspection work, mostly manual inspection work, to validate, to verify that it's okay, to verify that it conforms to the requirements, period. Okay. Now, if the product is going to be made in relatively large numbers, if it's very important that the product is up to quality, then you have to work on a lot of preventive measures, right? Spend more time, spend more resources during product development. First, to reduce the likelihood of issues, and second, to make it easier to detect the issues, right? So these are 2 separate topics here, but let me cover them, each of them quickly. First, you want to reduce the likelihood of issues. Well, that's why you have engineers look at the design and just review the design and ask some questions. Say, well, what is this going to be made with? What? And okay, plastic injection molded. So, and you need this one to fit into this one and to fit into this one, and the total tolerance has to be whatever, 0.01 mm of all the tolerances stacked up. Okay, that's not going to work, right? Or they say, well, what kind of polymer is going to be used here, and what are the typical issues here? What about the angles of the walls? What about the thickness of the walls? What about this? What about that? Typical defects, typical sources of defects. And engineers who look at that and ask these questions can put a finger on an issue so that it can be fixed very fast if it's still at the design stage, right? So a review and a risk analysis at the design stage, very important. And then every time there's a prototype, have the prototype tested, and you develop your checklist and your quality plan as you are making the prototypes. And every time you apply your checklist when, checking and testing the prototype, right? And at the same time, you will see, you will see some issues, right? You will see that maybe something is not very easy to test. Maybe the result is not really black or white. It needs some interpretation. Well, we know what's going to happen during mass production, right? They're going to interpret it in the way that it's fine, right? So also you can see that it takes time. Okay, and so that's the second point that I mentioned, is that you make it easier to detect the issues. If you have a mechanical part and there's 4 critical to quality dimensions, and they are machined by hand or something, there's going to be some variation. There's going to be variation. Well, you could simply work with the manufacturer so that they put together a checking fixture, so which means that someone will have the part in their hand, they just put it in the fixture, look, see if it fits, and it should be a very clear yes or no, or it could be a go no go gauge on a simple dimension. Okay, is it too small to go here and too large to go here? Yes. Okay. So it's within the tolerance. Go, And this is very, very common when you look at large productions, for example, in the automotive industry. There's other ways to do it. There's, for example, when they do the PCB assembly for electronic products, well, they do the automated optical inspection. They might have to program it slightly differently for different products, but it's very, very standard. They're really used to doing it. And then after that, they will use a functional test rig to actually test the functions, and they can be required to do that, both the automated optical inspection and using the functional test rig on every single board that is good to go, right? And if they do that properly, the right way, what is the likelihood that there's going to be issues down the road? Not that high. Now there might be a lot of issues, but hopefully they will catch them, right? That's making it easier to detect the issues, and as much as possible, you want to push that up the supply chain. You want to push that to your suppliers, right? So here my examples were about parts, right? Mechanical parts, PCBAs. But if you, let's say you're an importer and you work with a company that does assembly, inspection, packing, same thing. You can work with them to make sure their work instructions do include the important quality points and their inspection checklists and so on. And then you can check the way they actually inspect your product, right? And you can work with them hand in hand to define a standard. And in many cases, they should actually have a standard, but what is acceptable or what is not acceptable. I don't know. Let's say you make mobile phones and you don't want to scratch on the body you're going to have to define what scratch is acceptable and what scratch is not acceptable, because the manufacturer is going to say, look, give me any perfect product. I take a microscope and I'll find a lot of scratches, right? Or a magnifying glass or something. So it's never perfect, but you have to get in agreement on the exact standard. It goes back to setting a good standard to reduce confusion and so on, right? So working with suppliers is very, very important. I guess that's the key message. And there's a lot more that can be done, but then it goes a bit more into the audits, factory audits, how good are their process controls? How good is their preventive maintenance? How do they work with their own suppliers and so on and so forth? And that's not exactly like optimizing the product inspections, but
No.
it is replacing product inspections by something else, right? By instead of checking products and saying, okay, this batch is okay, this batch is not okay, you try to go upstream. And for that, you need to have a risk focus. You need to think, okay, what are the main risks from historical data, from our experience, from our observations? What are the main risks here, right? And you say, okay, so I don't know, we have a home appliance with some electronics, and there's an enclosure in plastic. Okay, what could go wrong? Maybe the plastic is not good. Well, we're gonna make sure we check the first samples off the tooling to validate that it's okay. All right, and then maybe every batch we check one piece. Okay, and that should be enough, right? As I mentioned earlier. What about the electronics? Oh, maybe the number one source of risk is there's some manual soldering. Maybe they get the PCB boards with some components, but then the assembly people put the battery and so on the board, and they do some manual soldering. Well, that is a very common, very typical source of a lot of function defects, and also potential safety issues in the field, depending on what could happen, short circuits and things like that on the board. So then in that case, what do? Well, you try to work on the process controls of this manual soldering operation. Then, okay, well, what are they soldering with? Would it be better if they have a soldering gun with a foot? Okay, so you do a little improvement. Then you say, okay, whenever you solder, you have to keep the gun on the part for 3 seconds, and you need to do a visual check on the other side of the board to make sure it's properly soldered, and you make sure it's translated into work instruction. You make sure that the local supervisor pays attention to it, make sure that people do it, and you have your own people to come and have a look from time to time to check that they actually do it. And that will reduce the likelihood of issues maybe by a factor of 2, 3, 5, right? It's not going to bring it to 0, but maybe at one point you push them to buy the equipment to do automated soldering. And then at that point, you need to make sure that they have the right people to do the setup and that they do the preventive maintenance right and so on, because it could actually make things even worse. But if they do all that right, then the number of, let's say the risk goes down by a factor of 10. Yeah, easily.
Right.
If it's very well set up and maintained, right? So that's, you move away from inspection of the product into looking at the process, the manufacturing process, and also improving the testing and measurement process.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get it. And basically, you put in this work to analyze the processes and what's actually happening with a focus on risk, and that has a knock-on effect on your inspections, because if you ultimately are operating with lower risk, then you can optimize those inspections. Potentially, you could do less or of a less severity, and There may be cost saving involved in that. I guess there might be time saving as well. That's the sort of benefits we're talking about, isn't it?
Yes. It depends
Okay.
on the situation. Yeah. If you're in a situation where every batch fails and there's a lot of quality issues, well, you want to reinforce your system. But
Sure.
do you put more resources on checking the product, the products to catch the defects once they are out there on the product? Or do you want to go upstream and actually prevent the issues? I mean, that would be much cheaper for all parties in the long run anyway.
Yeah, and at the top of the show, you mentioned that specific kinds of importers might be more interested in this topic.
If you're a small buyer with a bad relationship with your supplier, they will not let you put your nose into the way they do their work.
Right.
I would say that is a very common issue, especially in China. Some other countries like Vietnam, India can be more receptive as long as they don't feel that you're trying to learn to copy them. But in China, they don't tend to be very open and transparent. It depends on the suppliers, of course. I'm generalizing a lot here.
Yeah.
But that's the logical thing, do you actually have the weight to push your supplier to make changes or not, right? And if not, well, it's going to be either you keep working with the same supplier and you pay inspections all along, or you switch to another supplier. I mean, sometimes you don't have many options.
No. Well, and switching suppliers, you wrote an amazing ebook about that over on Agilian Technology, our contract manufacturing subsidiary. So I will leave the link to that in the show notes. Definitely download that if you're listening. So I think the final question I've got here, and this is quite related to your point about if you've got the weight to, drive a supplier to change, is potentially delegating more inspection work to the supplier themselves over time. So that's kind of self-inspections, right? Without raising risks.
So self-inspections, yes. Without raising risks, it depends. But it's relatively common, especially for retailers, to ask the suppliers, okay, give me your inspection report. And manufacturers also. Manufacturers for their critical parts often request that their suppliers share the inspection reports, right? And, well, 99% of the time, it'll be all good, no problem. Okay, passed.
Of course.
Go ahead, right? But it kind of forces them to look at their products and take a little bit of time to do an inspection, hopefully, right? So for buyers, it doesn't involve extra cost. Of course, they have to push the suppliers to do it, but the suppliers cannot really say, oh, it increases my cost, because then the buyer would say, wait a minute, you mean that you never check the quality before shipping to us, right? So suppliers cannot really use that excuse to raise the cost. And then if there is an issue found by the buyer, then the buyer can say, hey, how come you did not find it? Maybe we come and we see the way your inspector checks the product, so they can put some extra pressure, and the supplier knows that. So it tends to make suppliers a bit more careful, right? So it's not a bad thing. You need to push them to do that, and you need to maybe give them a bit of training, give them a template to fill out, right? That's the kind of efforts from the buyer's side that would be needed. And then the fact that they do their self-inspection doesn't mean that you as the buyer stop doing inspections.
Right.
Now, you might switch to inspections on random batches and keep an element of surprise and check, if it's a good supplier. Now, obviously, you want to do that mostly with good suppliers, right?
Yeah.
Good suppliers, and you buy a certain amount so you give them a certain amount of business, right? So you have some weight over them. if it's a good supplier, maybe you say, well, stop sending our inspectors all the time. Maybe we'll do it only 50% of the time from now on, and then we'll adjust again next year. But you have to give this to us for every batch. As soon as production is complete, you send that over to us. And then from time to time, we'll have our inspectors come and double check. You will not know from the start, right? So that works. Again, it doesn't cost much more on the buyer's side. And then before Chinese New Year, you should still get back to checking everything you can for reasons we covered before. The risk of inconsistent quality goes up exponentially just before and also after Chinese New Year in some factories. So that's the idea. So you save money on the good suppliers by sending your inspectors less often and maybe checking less in depth. But then what do? Do you reduce your resources for quality management? Or do you put more resources where it's needed? Maybe you hire a couple of quality engineers who go around, supplier quality engineers, who go around and look at the issues and put some pressure on the suppliers so they improve their processes and their systems, right? And do all the preventive work that we mentioned before.
Yeah.
That makes sense, because in the long run, then hopefully some of the suppliers that are not so good right now become better, and then you switch to self-inspection, and then you spend less on checking them up.
Yeah, that's better for everyone.
Exactly. What's not to like?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
So that's the virtuous cycle where you reallocate your budget, and in the long run, you can have better results with a lower budget.
Nice. That's what we were talking about. So at the top of the show, we were talking about optimizing QC inspections and getting better results. Those are some of the results which you can expect. And actually interesting that this wasn't all about the inspections themselves. Rather, you did talk about, process improvements and things like that, which has such an impact on the quality, and then the knock-on impact is on the requirement for inspections. So, that's a really interesting part of what you were talking about.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Well, that was the end of this episode. Some interesting resources going to be in the show notes. Renaud, bon voyage for your trip back to Hong Kong next time.
Yeah, thanks, yes.
Next time you're on the podcast, you'll be back in Asia. And
right.
This was actually quite related to what Andrew was talking about on last week's episode 118 as well, about reducing the risks of product returns, which again, very related to quality, and some of the preventive measures you've spoken about quite related to that episode. So if you didn't catch that episode last week, definitely go check it out too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thanks, Renaud. Thanks to all the listeners. And we'll catch you all soon.
Yeah, thanks. And you will hear from us next week as usual.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks again for listening to this podcast, brought to you by the Sofeast Group. We're on a mission to provide you with everything you need to manufacture effectively in Asia, including inspections, auditing, new product development support, contract manufacturing, 3PL warehousing and fulfillment, and much, much more across Asia's key manufacturing areas. Visit us at sofeast.com, that's SOFEAST.com, to learn more and get help. If you've enjoyed the podcast today, please do rate, review and share, because it will really help others discover us too.